Okay, let's get started. Sorry for the odd format of the class this week, y'all. Those of you who saw me yesterday, I legitimately was feeling pretty good, and then I just completely nosedived overnight. I don't know if I wasn't as well as I thought I was, or if I caught something else, or what the deal is. And sorry if I'm hard to understand here. I'm pretty congested today, but let's get to it. Okay, still talking about cartilage at the tissue level here. You're probably going to get a little tired of hearing about cartilage for the next few lectures here. The reason we spend so much time on this is one, because I personally study cartilage, so it's something that I know a lot about. And two, osteoarthritis, which is primarily a disease of cartilage, is a major, like really prevalent chronic disease. And it's one of the handful of diseases like that that you can talk yourself into it, biomechanics having a really prominent like central role in it. So in a biomechanics class in a school of public health, it's something that I feel like we should spend a bit of time on. So last time on Monday, we talked about cartilage and the relationship between load and stress. Stress in mechanics is the load applied to a tissue divided by the area of the tissue that load is seen by or felt by. So, for example, if I press with my thumb on my other thumb pad there with a force of, say, 100 newtons, that's 100 Newton load, but it's not a very big stress because I'm spreading that load out over a fairly large area. If I take my pen here and press into that same tissue with that same load, that hurts more because it caused more stress. It's that same load, but spread out over a smaller area. So dividing that same load by a smaller area results in a larger stress. And stress is largely for those reasons is a much better indicator of the risk of injury and damage to a tissue. So if you have a higher load and it results in a greater stress, that's probably a greater risk for injury. If you have a higher load, but it's spread out over a larger area and the stress is not greater or is even smaller, then that may not be a strong risk for injury. Talked about the fatigue life of cartilage, and that's a fancy way of saying how many cycles of loading of different stresses that a tissue like cartilage can withstand before it's damaged, and some relationships there between why a high load, high stress activity like running doesn't seem to cause a lot of osteoarthritis in live humans, even though in like explant samples of cartilage cyclically loading it with high stresses does result in injury to that cartilage. When the cartilage is in its living environment, it's still undergoing high stresses, but there's some aspects of the structure of cartilage as the collagen fibers are shaped that make it really good at withstanding those stresses. And there's also a bit of biology going on there, where at least up to certain ages, cartilage is really good at repairing and remodeling itself to get stronger in response to those stresses, which has important implications for physical activity and nutrition in childhood and in young adulthood. Basically, the cartilage that you build up to about age 20, maybe 25, if you're lucky, that's probably what you're going to be stuck with for the rest of your life. Okay, not an assigned reading or anything in the sense that you'll be tested over its content, but this is a good kind of intro level discussion on basic science of articular cartilage. So if you want a reading to go to that kind of elaborates on some of the content of the lectures this week, this is a good one to check out. It's one of my favorites. Okay, so we load our joints like our knees with these compressive loads highlighted here in the red boxes. Those loads come indirectly from the muscle forces that surround our joints here. Those are tensile forces that pull our joints into each other and press those articulating surfaces of the joints into each other, generating those compressive forces on the cartilage of that joint. And we talked last time about how cartilage is composed in terms of its solid pieces of these collagen fibers, which are arranged kind of vertically relative to the bone, down close towards the bone there, like where the cartilage attaches to the bone. Then in the middle, they kind of fan out into random directions. And in the top, they change directions entirely and are there in fact, parallel to the surface of the cartilage there. So when you load them in compression like that, it's kind of like trying to break a string by pressing on it from the top, which is a really difficult. You could break a string like that, but it'd be really difficult to break a string like that. It'd be a lot easier to snip it or pull it. So cartilage is kind of arranged in a way that its primary load of or a primary mode of loading being loaded, superficially from the top there, does not in fact induce large stresses along the long axis of those collagen fibers. Nonetheless, cartilage, when we take it out of its living environment, does indeed break down quite a bit quicker when we load it with high cyclical stresses compared to if we load it with lower cyclical stresses. Now, let's elaborate a little bit on this business of the stress that a tissue like cartilage experiences and what results mechanically from that stress as it relates to injury, and how live human joints are still able to withstand those high stresses without this being a big problem, at least in many cases. I don't want to give you the idea that you can just load your joints indefinitely with whatever forces you want and it's not going to be a problem. It can indeed be a problem. But within like the normal voluntary ranges of like the amount and intensity of activity that people are doing, you generally don't have to worry all that much about like wearing out the cartilage of your joints. And let's see if we can reason out why that is here. So we introduced this concept of stress last time. Stress is the force or load that a tissue experiences divided by the area that load is spread out over, or the area that sees the force, the plane of loading of that force. Now, the mechanical consequence of stressing a tissue, applying a load to that tissue that's distributed over a certain area, is called strain. Okay, so there's a stress-strain relationship in tissues like cartilage or in tissues or in deformable materials in general. So strain is a term that I've used quite a bit that you probably have heard before, but maybe it's never been mechanically or physically defined for you before. So let's attach a clear formal definition here to this term strain. Strain is what results mechanically from stress. You apply a stress to a material, and that results in strain. Strain mechanically is defined as deformation. And what do I mean by deformation? It's a change in the characteristic length, or just more generally or more broadly, like a change in shape of the material that's being loaded and being stressed. This could be a change in shape in terms of elongation, like if I take a tissue and grab it and pull it and stretch it. It can also be a change in shape of the material in terms of compression, like if I take a material and I grab it and I squish it and compress it. So both of those things would be, broadly speaking, strain, a change in the kind of resting or unloaded shape of the material. And we typically define strain as being relative to that kind of reference unloaded shape. Like if I have, let me see if I can find a good example here. I've got this little pear-shaped light up here on my bookshelf. And right now, as it's at rest, it's not being loaded at all. Okay, so this would be kind of its default shape. I can then take it and apply forces to it and change its shape. Here I'm applying a load to it to compress it, to squish it with my hand. And then when I release that load, it unsquishes, it returns to its original shape. So think about like attaching some number to its default unloaded state here, and then reducing that number when I squish it and compress it there. Okay, the percent change in shape, or if you want to think about like some dimension there, the percent reduction in that dimension relative to its unloaded state, that would be the strain that results from this squishy stress that I'm applying to it. So like last time, like we talked about, how big are stresses, generally speaking, in human musculoskeletal tissues? How about how big are the strains that result in those stresses? Generally speaking, not all that big. Bone, for example, we define bone in terms of like the strains it experiences being like micro strains, like thousandths of a percent strain. So bone is very stiff. It does deform a little bit, but not a whole lot. Tendon deforms by like 4 to 10%. A 10% strain on most tendons would be a pretty large strain. So if your tendon is 10 centimeters long and you stretch it to 11 centimeters long, that would be a 10% elongation or a 10% strain, and that'd be a fairly large strain for most tendons. Cartilage, depending again on what movement you're doing and how much stress you're actually applying to it, might deform by like 5 to 30%. If you want to like completely squish and bottom out the cartilage and like deform it all the way down to the bone, you can do that, but that would take a very, very large stress on most types of cartilage to do that. So strains in the human body, generally speaking, are not tremendously large. Squishing something to like half of its unloaded length or stretching it to like double its unloaded length is not generally something you can do to a tissue without like rupturing it or tearing it. Now, from my words I've said here, you may have the impression that there's a relationship between stress and strain, and there is mechanically, generally speaking. The symbol that we typically use for stress is this one that kind of looks like a goofy looking O here. That's the Greek lowercase sigma. And the symbol here that we typically use for strain is this kind of goofy looking E here. That's the Greek lowercase epsilon, the symbol for strain. Stress and strain are related to each other by this fancy parameter E here, which is the modulus of elasticity. That's a fancy term for basically the stiffness of the material that's being stressed. Okay, so why don't we just call it stiffness? Why do we use modulus of elasticity? The distinction there is that the modulus of elasticity is what's known as a material property, meaning it's independent of the amount of the material. It depends only on the type of the material. Like for example, if I have like a paper thin, like really, really thin sheet of steel, I might be strong enough to be able to bend that steel because there's not very much of it, right? Whereas if it's like a piece of steel that's as thick as like my wife's laptop computer here, that even though it's still made out of steel, there's too much of it. It's too thick. I won't be able to bend it. So those different amounts of steel would have different practical stiffnesses, even though they're both made out of the same material. They would have the same modulus of elasticity because they're both made out of the same material. And just then just the more of that material you have, the stiffer it's going to be. But a piece of paper here that's, say, half a millimeter thick would have a lower modulus of elasticity than a piece of steel, for example, that's that same thickness. Okay, so it's think of it as like a stiffness parameter that depends only on the type of the material and is not dependent on the amount of the material that's present there. So a property that's only a property of the material itself, not the amount of the material. So stress and strain are related to each other through that modulus of elasticity, where if you apply a certain stress, that results in a certain strain, and the ratio there, like how much stress it takes to result in a given strain, is a function of your modulus of elasticity. So basically, the bigger that modulus of elasticity is, or the bigger the stiffness of that material is, the more stress you're going to have to apply to result in a given strain. Okay. Often over like low ranges of stress and strain, that relationship is linear, like you see here, like a 5% increase in stress would be a 5% increase in strain. If you're talking like very wide ranges of stresses and strains being applied, that relationship can often be nonlinear and can look something more like this down here. Don't worry too much about the specifics of the mathematics there. It's just another possible form of saying, yes, as you apply more stress, that's going to result in more strain proportionate to your modulus of elasticity, but it's not necessarily like a linear straight line relationship all the time. But for at least for small ranges of stresses and strains, it's often a very reasonable approximation to just assume it's a roughly linear relationship like we see up there, even though in practice it'll strictly speaking be a non-linear relationship for many biological materials. Okay, so we've got stress defined mechanically, we've got strain defined mechanically. Another term that I've used quite a bit that you've probably heard of before and have a concept of is this notion of damage. Okay, damage in just general material science is like long-lasting strain to the structure, to the material that's being loaded. And so a distinction I can give you there is here's my piece of paper here, and I can deform this paper with small stresses that bend it and change its shape. But when I remove that stress, when I remove the impetus for straining it and changing that shape, it goes back to its original unloaded shape. There's no long-lasting, uh, permanent consequences of uh, stressing and straining that material. Okay, so I can apply fairly small stresses to it that change its shape, it strains it, but then when I remove that stress, the strain also goes away and it goes back to its original shape. Okay. If I strain it further, like if I apply larger and larger stresses to it that result in more strain, like if I stress it enough to like bend it and crease it here, okay, then when I remove my hands applying that stress, it doesn't go back to its original shape. Right now it's folded and kind of stuck, like it has a new default unloaded shape here. Okay? Now I could take this and I could flatten it out and I can try and kind of get rid of that crease I just put in it, but there's still a little bit of it there. And so more broadly speaking, I could take this and like crumple it up, right? So there I applied large stresses to it. And when I remove those stresses, here it's unloaded, but it's still stuck in that new default, like smaller compressed shape there. It's not going to go back to its original shape. I could unfold it here and I could like, flatten it out and stick it under like a heavy book or something overnight, and maybe that would get it back, kind of close to its original shape. But it's not easily going to completely remove the effect of those large stresses that I just applied to it. And then the more extreme case is I could take it and I could apply really large stresses to it, right? And then I've ruptured it. Then I've strained it so much that now it's split and it's two separate pieces, and there's no way, it's at least no easy way that it's going to go back to its original shape then. So damage in terms of materials and especially in terms of biological materials, you can think of it as in terms of like a structural injury. It's long-lasting strain, kind of a permanent change in the resting length or resting shape of that material. In material science, that's known as plastic deformation, meaning you strained a thing and then you remove the stress and it doesn't pop back to its original shape. It stays in some deformed shape different from its original shape because the stresses you applied to it was so big. It's a strain that persists even when the stress is then removed. So that's the rationale. Oops, sorry, that's the rationale for comments that I've made earlier on, where there's basically three stages of loading here on kind of the pathway towards damage and injury. You load a tissue. This results in stresses to that tissue, depending on how that load was distributed on that tissue. And then that stress results in strains of that tissue, depending on how much that stress deformed that tissue. Okay. And then if those strains are too large or too severe, that results in damage, a permanent change, more or less permanent change to the structure of the material. So if you're going to rank order these three things in terms of like what's the best predictor of the risk for damage and injury to a tissue like cartilage or tendon or muscle or bone or whatever, number one, by far, the best predictor is the amount of strain that happens, because strain literally is injury. It's deformation of that tissue, at least in terms of injury for a biomechanical definition. So strain is the number one best predictor of the risk for injury of a tissue from a biomechanics perspective. Stress would be number two, because stress results in strain. It's just not necessarily always a linear relationship. And load would be number three, and I would say a distant number three, just knowing the load on a tissue. Like if you and I walk with in ways where like my load on my cartilage is greater than your load on your cartilage, that's not necessarily an injury risk. You'd have to know something about the area that that load is distributed over, and ideally something about the strain that results from that distribution of that load. So number one, best predictor of injury in a biomechanics perspective, strain. Number two, stress. And then I would say a distant number three, the load that results in those things. Okay, so now that we have some kind of biomechanics definitions here of load and stress and strain and injury, now we can kind of start thinking about, okay, what does cartilage look like as we load it cyclically with large loads and large stresses and large strains again and again and again. You'll often see like grading scales for the structural progression of osteoarthritis based on the evident amount of damage that appears in the cartilage in a particular joint. And so that would be something like just this is just like a nebulous joint here, but like not a specific joint, but just picture this as being like a knee, for example. You have your bone here that the cartilage is attached to. And early on, like the earliest possible stages where you might think, oh, there could be something mechanically going on here, you'll see like some blisters, like some little abrasions or just small abnormalities in the structure of the cartilage there. As that abnormality is loaded more and more and more and damaged more and more and more, you'll get these fissures or cracks superficially from the top down, like the loaded surface, down deeper into the cartilage here. Okay. Those will worsen over time into larger and broader and deeper cracks. And eventually, kind of late stage or end stage osteoarthritis, you'll have cracks and fissures that go all the way down to the bone here. And now this would be like a bone on bone situation. If you picture like another side of the joint on the top there, pressing into that grade 4 osteoarthritis joint there. Now, that's problematic for at least for symptoms of osteoarthritis because remember, cartilage, we said in a healthy state, cartilage doesn't have a direct connection to the nervous system. And so, what does that have to do with like pain and symptoms of injury and stuff? My skin and muscle of my thumb here, that does have connections to the nervous system. And so that's why when I press on it sharply here, with large stresses, ow, ow, that hurts. You know, that generates a painful signal, a painful sensation. Or if I put my hand on the hot stove, that generates pain. That's my body saying, wait a minute, that I'm going to make that hurt and be painful because if you keep doing that, I think you're going to permanently damage me. So that generates a painful sensation, which causes me to react to that pain by removing the stimulus causing that pain. Cartilage doesn't have, by default, cartilage doesn't have anything like that. It doesn't have connections to the nervous system saying, hey, deforming me is painful because cartilage is supposed to be deformed. That's its purpose. It allows some flexibility and some cushioning and some padding between our hard bones. Okay? Bone, on the other hand, does have connections to the nervous system. It's surrounded by a connective tissue that is innervated. And when you apply direct loads, direct stresses and strains to that connective tissue that surrounds bone, that's painful because remember, bone doesn't like to undergo large strains. Large strains on bone are a great way to damage bone. And you want some damage to bone, just like you want some damage to cartilage and muscles. That's the stimulus for those tissues to grow to grow stronger, to get repaired and remodeled into stronger tissues. But of course, there's a kind of a Goldilocks relationship there where too little is bad, then you don't get the stimulus to get strong. Too much is bad, then you have too much to repair and recover from, but right in the middle is the moderate amount to make the tissue healthy and strong. Okay, so you're probably getting tired of seeing this figure, but none, oh, sorry. Nonetheless, cartilage undergoes large stresses when we take it out of its living environment, and it can't withstand those stresses very many times. Okay. And if we load it with low stresses, this is okay. Okay, it can withstand those loads lots of different times. But notice the scale here. This is, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, million loading cycles. Even a million loading cycles here is not very many for like the lifetime of a tissue like cartilage, right? Like if we do the recommended 10,000 steps per day, that's 5,000 loading cycles on each joint on each side of the body, assuming you're walking symmetrically. Take that times 365 days times human lifespan of years, and that's many, many, many millions of loading cycles, right? And we saw last time that activities like walking and running actually place moderately high stresses on the tissues of our on the tissues like cartilage, like in our knee joint, right? So somehow, when we place these cartilage tissues that can't withstand these high stresses very many times. When we put them in like a living body, something magical seems to be happening. Like it seems to be able to somehow withstand those high stresses and high strains. Okay? We talked a little bit last time about how cartilage is able to resist injury from high stresses that it experiences in real life, even though when you take it outside of a living body, it doesn't seem like it's able to do that. So now that we have this formal definition of strain and damage, let's revisit this idea. Let's see how cartilage in a living body is able to undergo high loads and high stresses and maybe even high strains without this necessarily being a problem. We saw some insights into biologically what can happen there in the previous lecture in terms of the ability, at least up to a young age, to adapt and remodel and repair and get stronger from that damage. But let's revisit this idea with some new information here. So one way that cartilage is able to undergo high stress, high loads and high stresses without necessarily developing a lot of damage is, like we said last time, those collagen fibers that are near the top of the cartilage. So if you're not clear what this image is looking like here, at the bottom here, that would be the bone that the cartilage is attached to. And then your cartilage, which is composed in terms of its solid phase primarily of collagen fibers, they start kind of running vertically out of the bone there, and then they kind of fan out into random directions in the middle, and then they kind of orient themselves parallel at the top there. Okay. So when we're loading a tissue like cartilage, we would be loading it with compressive forces on the top there. So think about taking this little chunk of cartilage and like squishing it down from the top. Okay. And remember, those fissions, those lesions, those cracks in the cartilage typically develop from the top down. Now, there's competing theories there on osteoarthritis and whether it results like from the top down or from the bottom up. But generally speaking, regardless of like where it's originating from like a causal perspective, the cracks and lesions almost always start from the top down here and then proceed down towards the bone like that. So the surface here that gets loaded, again, it's kind of like if I were to take this piece of paper where it's oriented perpendicular to my surface of loading here, I could take it and hit it and beat on it like this all day long, and I'm probably not going to crack and rip that paper, right? An easier way to rip it is I could grab it and pull on it, or I could take it and shear it and rip it, right? But that's not how cartilage gets loaded at a macroscopic scale. It gets loaded in compression like that, making it really hard to break and snap this paper, right? Same story here. If I have these little strands of cartilage oriented sideways like that, the best way to break them would be to like grab them and pull them like that, or to take them and shear them and snip them like that. And that's not the type of loading that cartilage undergoes in a living body. It undergoes compressive loading like that. And so the fibers are oriented in a way that it's really good at withstanding that loading. Okay. Nonetheless, when you undergo that, it is indeed possible to snap those little fibers there, and that's what results in those little cracks starting at the top, and then they get deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. Okay? Particularly once you bust through this top layer up here, and they're no longer oriented perpendicular to the surface of loading there, it gets easier for loading to damage the collagen fibers when they're not oriented in that, excuse me, not oriented in that way. That's good at resisting that damage. And also remember, cartilage doesn't have a direct connection to the circulatory system. And like we talked about last time, beyond the age of like 20 or so, it has limited capacity at best to repair and remodel itself from that type of damage. And so typically when you start getting like a lesion at the top of the cartilage here, it's hard to actually get it in the first place. But once you do have it, it's not going to naturally heal and repair itself like an injury to a muscle fiber or a tendon or a bone or something with a connection, a direct connection to the circulatory system throughout the lifespan might be able to do. So that orientation of the collagen fibers, that's one of the reasons why uh, cartilage is really good at withstanding high loads and high stresses, and why we can do things like run and lift weights and play sports and don't often have to worry about it causing osteoarthritis. We generate that compressive load, which because of the orientation of those collagen fibers starting perpendicular on the bone and then fanning out and then getting parallel at the top there, because that then sustains compressive loading, makes it really hard to stretch those superficial collagen fibers in tension. Nonetheless, it is possible to still break and snap them. And so this isn't a foolproof way of preventing damage to cartilage, but it is a way of reducing the odds of damage to cartilage. Okay, so like we said, that orientation on its own is not perfect. So what else can we do here to help ourselves out with cartilage in terms of resisting damage? You've heard me mention a couple times that cartilage is composed of collagen, which is this kind of squishy material, which gives it its overall shape and structure. Cartilage is also composed of fluid. Okay, so if you want to split it broadly into two categories of what it's made of a solid material, primarily collagen, and it's made of a liquid material that's kind of like water, but is not strictly speaking just water, but it has many material properties similar to water. It's strictly speaking, it's synovial fluid. It's got other stuff in it that like water out of your faucet or water in a lake doesn't have, but it behaves mechanically quite a bit like water. So to describe the full structure of cartilage with both that solid collagen phase and that liquid water type phase and their interaction together, you'll often hear cartilage described as being biphasic and poroviscoelastic. And you probably don't know what either of those things mean. You know, what is biphasic? And certainly what does poroviscoelastic mean? These are fairly complicated terms here. They're not all that complicated. Let's just walk through them here. Biphasic, bi means two, like tri means three, bi means two, and phasic means phase, right? So biphasic means two phases. So that's just a way of saying, and probably more complicated than it needs to, but in like a shorthand way, that cartilage consists of two phases of matter. There's a solid phase and there's a liquid phase. That solid phase, you'll often see that called the extracellular matrix, and that's composed primarily of two different materials, collagen and proteoglycans. Collagen gives the whole material, the whole chunk of cartilage, kind of its overall structure and shape. The proteoglycans then bind to that collagen and give it its broader material properties, like its stiffness and its damping and its ability to absorb impacts and the energy from impacts. The liquid phase, then that's the material that's kind of like water, which is more strictly speaking synovial fluid. And the binding of that liquid phase within that solid phase is what gives it its ability to absorb energy and also gives it its lubrication, such that you're not able to shear and generate a lot of like frictional loading on cartilage, which it's not good at withstanding at that superficial level. Okay, so biphasic, two phases, they interact together to give cartilage its broader material properties. How about this other term here, poroviscoelastic? What does that mean? Let's just break it down here. There's three terms there, poro, viso, and elastic. So let's do one at a time here. Poro means it's porous, meaning it's a material that's permeable to fluid or that it's kind of spongy, like the sponge used to wash your dishes with. You grab it and you squeeze it, and the water comes out. You unsqueeze it, and it can soak up water again. Okay, so it's permeable to fluids. This is good because this is, remember how cartilage undergoes nutrient transport. It doesn't have a direct connection to the circulatory system, meaning there's nothing like pumping blood directly into cartilage, giving it nutrients or giving it its nutrients like many other materials in the body get. However, it is surrounded in this synovial fluid, which is rich in these nutrients. And so by being porous, by being permeable to that fluid, we can squish it and squish the old used up fluid out and unsquish it, unstrain it as it returns to its resting shape. It'll rush the new nutrient-rich fluid in. Okay? So that porous nature is helpful for what I'll say metabolic reasons. That's how we get the nutrients inside cartilage that it needs to be a healthy tissue. It's also important for mechanical reasons because this is how cartilage is able to withstand high loads without undergoing large strains of the collagen. This is hard for me to demonstrate without making a mess. I've got some water here, but I'll make a mess if I try to do it. But think about taking like a solid material, like a sponge, and trying to squish it with your hands. That's rather easy to do, right? So it's fairly easy for you to apply large strains to a dry sponge, right? So if cartilage was just made out of solid spongy stuff and didn't have this fluid phase, it would be very easy to apply large strains and lots of damage to that sponge and to that cartilage. But now think about taking like a chunk of water and trying to like squish it and compress it and deform it. You can't really, right? It would leak out little holes in your hands, or it would get all over and spread everywhere. It is possible to like squish and compress water, but it takes tremendously large forces and large strains to do that. Okay, so water is largely incompressible, and it's very difficult to squish it and deform it. Okay, typically when you squish water, it just spreads out and goes somewhere else when you try to squish it. So by having this water that's embedded in this collagen membrane, when you squish it, you're able to have a lot of the strains resulting from that stress, from that squish, get applied to the water and not to the collagen itself. And it's okay to stress and strain a liquid like water because that's very reversible, right? Like here, I already showed you with my paper, if I take like a solid material and stress it a lot, that's very easy to result in like permanent damage to it, permanent strain, right? If I take water, like here's my water, and then I'm gonna separate it completely. Here's it spread out into two separate chunks of water now. Can I get it to like go back to its original shape? Yeah, that's very easy to do, right? Just put it back in and everything's good, right? So it's really impossible to like rip and tear a material like water. You can separate it, but then as soon as you introduce it back to each other, it just becomes a whole again. Unlike, say, this solid, where if I separate it into two, it's basically impossible to get it back into one. Okay? So by having this liquid that is kind of stuck, at least temporarily, inside this solid phase, I can squish and deform that liquid and offload some of the strains from the solid part onto the liquid part, where I can damage the solid part with strains that are too high. You can't really damage the liquid part, which with strains that are too high. Okay, so that's the poro part of poro, viscoelastic. How about the other two? Visco, that's a fancy word for damping or damped. And elastic, that's a fancy word for springy. Okay, and I introduce those together because they're kind of indelibly coupled to each other. Um, the springiness of cartilage results from the solid phase, the collagen and the proteoglycans. Um, when you take a spring and you squish it, it then reloads back to its original self. Okay. Unlike something like, say, a harder material like bone, where if you take it and you bend it or squish it, you probably crack it if you deform it by any appreciable amount, and it's not going to unload back to its original shape. Okay? That squishy solid phase combined with this liquid phase also gives cartilage its overall viscous or damped behavior here. Okay. Now, damping, this is a little bit harder to understand than like springiness. You can kind of think of a material that's damped as being like a springy material, except for the springy material relates kind of to the deformation of the material, and the damping of the material relates to the speed of that deformation. And let me show you an example of what I mean there. A springy material is you squish it and you deform it by a little bit. And if you want to squish it more, you got to apply a bigger force to it. Okay. So the more you want to squish it, the harder you got to push on it, the more force you got to apply. Okay. So the more force you apply, the further you deform the thing. Okay. That's springiness. That's elasticity. Um, Damping is kind of that same thing, but not relating to the amount of deformation, but relating to the speed of deformation. Okay. A springy material, the further you deform it, the more force that takes. A damped material, the faster you deform it, the more force that takes. Okay. Um, Solid materials tend to have springiness to them. Liquid materials or solid materials with liquids bound to them, like cartilage have, tend to have damping to them. And let me demonstrate why that is. This might be hard to see on my little video here. It's easier if you just get like a vessel of water and try and demonstrate it for yourself. But take your water here and stick your finger in it and just move your finger around in that water really slowly. Okay. It hardly resists you at all. Okay. You're deforming that water very slowly, so it's not pushing on you very hard. Okay. Now, move your finger around in the water and gradually speed it up. As you speed it up, you should feel larger and larger forces applied to your finger there. It's not because you are deforming the water more. I was going along the same path there. I was deforming it by the same amount each time. But as I'm deforming it faster and faster and faster, I'm trying to move that water out of the way faster and faster and faster, which takes more force and more work. And the water is resisting me as I do that faster and faster. Okay. So consequences here is for a material like cartilage, which has a solid phase, but also a lot of liquid bound to that solid phase, is that the faster you try to load that material, the stiffer it gets. Okay. And remember, there's a relationship between stress and strain and stiffness. The stiffer that I make a material, that's that modulus of elasticity from a few slides ago, the stiffer you make a material, the larger stress you have to apply to it to get a given strain. Okay. So the overall kind of macroscopic mechanical consequence of all this stuff, of all this biphasic poro-viscoelastic business, is that as you try to load cartilage faster, something like walking where I'm loading it relatively slowly with small forces versus running where I'm loading it relatively quickly with large forces, as I load it quickly, it gets stiffer because I'm trying to push all this water out of the way faster and it stiffens up in response to that, such that I get smaller strains for a given stress. Okay. Compared to if I say didn't have any water in my cartilage, I would get much, much larger strains in that cartilage because it's not stiffening up from that fluid content. So having all this water in the, or all this synovial fluid, which is kind of like water in the cartilage, allows it to stiffen up when I'm trying to squish it and load it quickly, which results in less strain for a given stress compared to if I didn't have that water in there where I'd get larger strains for that same stress. You can kind of experience this for yourself if you take like a dish sponge and squish it slowly and squeeze all that water out. That's real easy. Versus if you try to squish it quickly, you can still squeeze all that water out, but it resists you harder. It takes larger stresses to get that same squish there. Now, a practical example of this is one of my favorite videos here in the class. I live in a residential neighborhood that has there's like a loop where there's people don't have a lot of driveways, and there's not a lot of sidewalks. And so you get a lot of like children playing in the street and a lot of people like walking dogs in the street. And so the speed limit is fairly slow. It's only about 20 miles per hour. And really, you should probably only drive about 15 on it at the most. And to encourage people to drive slow, there's speed bumps everywhere. Okay, so like concrete bumps in the road that are intended to keep you driving slow. If you drive too fast over the concrete bump, it's bad for your car and you can go airborne and stuff, things that you don't want to do in a car typically. It's kind of annoying when you are driving the speed limit though, like when you're driving slowly and responsibly, that you still have to go over these bumps. And I was thinking a few years ago, like, wouldn't it be cool if somehow they could make a bump that like only hurt you or only penalize you if you're driving too fast. And then if you're going like a normal speed, there's basically no bump. We don't have a lot of speed bumps like that in the United States. There's some places in Spain that have developed speed bumps like this, where the faster that you try to drive over them, the faster you're trying to squish them, and the stiffer they get. Okay. They do this by building the speed bump not out of concrete, but by building it out of a water-filled material, such that if you drive over it slowly, it's really easy to deform that water and squish it out of the way. The faster you try to drive over it, the stiffer it gets and the more it resists you, such that if you drive over it really fast, it's basically a completely stiff speed bump. So here's a video of this in action here.
Whether you respect the speed limit or not, you and your car will suffer from the conventional speed bumps anyway. In order to end the driver's everyday frustration, we have created the BIV, the first intelligent speed bump. Traveling at a moderate speed, the soft bump yields. If you drive too fast, however, the speed bump becomes an obstacle. The intelligence of the BIV can be found inside it. It is a fluid whose solid particles line up whenever pressure is applied at high velocities. Therefore, the material allows the speed bump to change from a soft to a solid state, according to the vehicle's speed. The next generation of speed bumps, the intelligent speed bump, BIV by Badenova.
So that in a nutshell is basically how cartilage works. When you try to deform it slowly, you have lots of time to push that water out of that solid spongy-like material, and it doesn't resist you very hard. When you try to deform it quickly, there's not enough time to push the water out of the way. It stays in the solid collagen matrix for a longer amount of time. And remember, because you can't really squish and deform water, you can just push it around. That causes the whole cartilage material, the collagen and the proteoglycans, plus the synovial fluid, to behave overall like it's a stiffer material. It's still the same material. It's not changing that modulus of elasticity of like the collagen, but it's seeming to behave stiffer because it's got more of that water in it, that largely incompressible water in it, resisting you because you're trying to squish it and push it out of the way too fast to actually squish it all out of the way and deform that solid phase. Okay. So what you saw there for that speed bump in that cool part of the video where when she slowly like dips her finger in it, it basically just behaves like water. But if she takes it and like smacks it with her fist, it behaves like a harder, solid material. That's basically how cartilage acts. And it's because it's, yes, this solid phase, but also it's got this liquid phase bound in it, behaving like a sponge where it takes a finite amount of time to squish all that water out of the sponge. And if you don't squish it out, then you're trying to squish and deform the liquid part instead of the solid part. And you can't really squish and deform liquid, at least unless you're applying tremendously large forces to it. So now when we revisit that figure that we ended with last time, hopefully the impact of this and the importance of this should be a little bit more clear. So on the y-axis here is the amount of strain on the cartilage material. And again, 0 up here would be no strain. And then as we go down south here, that would be larger strains. They shaped this figure kind of funny here. And then the x-axis here is the number of loading cycles. And so this is a living piece of cartilage being loaded in compression again and again and again and again and again, many thousands of times. Okay. So you can see there the strain that it develops from that repeated loading evolves over time and over a few thousand cycles kind of settles out here into a total of about maybe like a 22% strain, so squishing it like 22% of its total length there. And you can see a large fraction of that 22% strain, roughly about, I don't know, 17% of that 22% is viscous strain, meaning that's strain and deformation happening to the liquid part of the cartilage, strain resulting in like pushing and squishing that liquid out of the way. And so about 22 to, oh, sorry, about 22% total and about 17% of it coming from strains applied to the liquid phase, meaning only about 5% of that total strain is to the actual damage-prone material to the cartilage. Now, picture a situation where we were applying these same stresses but didn't have any water in this cartilage, then all of that strain would be experienced by the solid phase, by the collagen. It'd be much easier to rip and tear and damage um, those collagen fibers. And so having a lot of water in here in cartilage, which is not really water, it's nutrient-rich synovial fluid, it's good for metabolic reasons. That's how cartilage gets its nutrients delivered to it, but it's also good, and I would say essential also for mechanical reasons. It's how cartilage is able to undergo large stresses and large strains as a whole material without actually experiencing large stresses and large strains on the damage-prone part of cartilage, which is that solid phase, that collagen matrix. Okay, if you haven't noticed already, I like to end with some caveats on how you should temper the strength of the conclusions that we have here. Um, we've been talking about osteoarthritis in this class in these last few lectures, largely from a structural perspective, which is defined typically by like the mechanical state of the cartilage. So looking at like a picture of cartilage and seeing how much damage and tearing is there to the cartilage and to the collagen fibers. That's typically how a disease like osteoarthritis will be graded and evaluated from a structural perspective. Um, Along with that, and not necessarily paired in parallel with that, is the symptoms of osteoarthritis. It has a number of symptoms, but the chief one is pain and discomfort in the affected joint, like within the knee joint for knee osteoarthritis. And you might think there's a fairly strong correlation there between having worse structural damage and having worse symptoms. And there is like a rough correlation there, but not always like a strong correlation. People that have osteoarthritis, the pain kind of, the structure is what it is, but the pain kind of comes and goes. You have good days and bad days. And just because you have a lot of damage to the cartilage doesn't necessarily mean there'll be a lot of pain. And just because you don't have a lot of damage to the cartilage doesn't necessarily mean there won't be a lot of pain. You can also see like kind of diverging diagnoses here where the structure doesn't line up at all with the symptoms. Like if you look at the knees of most like middle-aged long-term athletes, you could probably find like, at least one like good, well-qualified, good at their job, like radiologist who would look at an X-ray or an MRI of that joint and would say this person has early stage, mid stage, maybe even late stage osteoarthritis, but they don't have any pain, right? So the relationship between the structure of the disease and the symptoms of the disease often isn't quite that strong or often isn't super strong. Um, Cartilage in a healthy state is not innervated. There's nothing in it telling it that, oh, hey, you're squishing me. I don't like that. I'm going to generate a pain signal because cartilage is supposed to be squished and deformed. That's its job. That's its role in the body. Once it's become damaged, though, or once early stage osteoarthritis has onset and has started to develop, then cartilage and osteoarthritic cartilage will sometimes develop direct innervations, direct connections to the nervous system, perhaps as a protective mechanism, perhaps as saying, oh, okay, now you've started major damage to me. I don't think it's going to get repaired or fixed, so I'm going to give you this painful signal to kind of back off here to let you know I'm not liking this type of loading anymore. And that can often lead to this kind of vicious cycle in osteoarthritis. Remember, we said that obesity can be a risk factor for osteoarthritis, independent of physical activity and independent of mechanical loading, even in some cases. So your knee starts to hurt and you get this painful signal. And so you don't exercise as much, and maybe you don't modify your diet accordingly, and you gain some weight. And then when you do exercise, when the pain is tolerable, you're loading it with heavier loads because you weigh more and you worsen the damage. And then there's the whole inflammatory aspect of osteoarthritis, which can make things even worse. And so it can end up being kind of this vicious cycle, perhaps explaining the progression of the disease from an earlier mild case. Okay, that is it for today. Covered injury in terms of structural mechanics and variable most directly related to the presence and severity of an injury. An injury in biomechanics terms is a permanent change to the shape and structure of the material. Here I've got my piece of paper. I can change its shape with small stresses and strains and remove that stress, and it goes back to its original shape. If I apply large stresses and strains, then I permanently change its shape, and that would be an injury in biomechanics, a permanent shape to the or permanent change to the structure of material that doesn't go away when I remove the thing that was originally causing that change in shape. The variable in mechanics most directly predictive of that would be the strain itself. So strain, number one best predictor of damage and injury, because strain literally is damage. Stress causes strain, number two predictor. Load causes stress, number three predictor. Covered a number of explanations for why cartilage is really well suited for withstanding a lifetime of mechanical loading, at least in many cases. The shape and structure of the collagen fibers makes it really hard to load those fibers in tension when you're squishing them from the top. And the overall biphasic poroviscoelastic nature of cartilage, where it's this solid collagen matrix with this fluid embedded in it, a variety of reasons there why having that fluid embedded in the collagen matrix makes it possible to load up the whole tissue with large loads, large stresses, large strains without necessarily resulting in large stresses and large strains on the collagen itself, which is the damage-prone material. Okay, that wiped me out pretty good. I'm gonna go lay on the couch for a little bit. Hope everybody has a nice weekend, and I will hopefully be feeling better on Monday, and we will be back to normal. So take care, and we will see you later.